On a fall Saturday in Columbus, there's no doubt where the attention of most of the city will be. Nearly 100,000 people make the journey to Ohio Stadium to watch an Ohio State football game.
Every time you talk to a graduate of The Ohio State University, half their memories are of what happened in Ohio Stadium. It's either the Snow Bowl or an opportunity to see the marching band come on in the field prior to a game, or just being in the stadium to be part of a crowd of over 95,000 people.
When completed in 1922, Ohio Stadium was called the greatest single enterprise the university had ever taken. It was the biggest football stadium west of the Alleghenies, an architectural wonder that brought fame and prominence to the state of Ohio. But the development and building of Ohio Stadium was no easy task. In fact, it was built against unforeseen barriers and adverse criticism. Critics said the stadium would never be filled, that it was too expensive, that building materials would not withstand the test of time.
I believe the stadium is a dream. How do you make your dreams come true? That's the question.
Join us for a story that has never been told. A story of great risk and struggle. A story of a stadium built against all odds.
If you're trying to get some concept of the task that was involved in getting Ohio Stadium here, I think you have to go back to the humble beginnings of Ohio State University in general.
At the turn of the century, The Ohio State University was known as the College in a Cornfield. Born 30 years earlier on the site of an old farm, only 20 buildings graced the campus. Enrollment barely topped 1,400 students. The campus itself was fairly isolated from the downtown area of Columbus, a growing city with a population of 200,000. Because campus was so far away from the hustle and bustle of downtown, students were dependent on their own resources for entertainment and recreation. Sports, particularly football, became a popular diversion. In 1890, students organized an official team with a volunteer coach and scheduled games against nearby colleges such as Ohio Wesleyan and Denison. Games were played at Recreation Park, located at High Street and Whittier, south of downtown. But students soon tired of walking 9 miles from campus to the park and back again to see a game. 182 students petitioned the university to provide more extensive athletic grounds on campus. It took a few years, and by 1898, football games were played on the university's new athletic grounds, Ohio Field.
Ohio Field at the turn of the century was little more than a converted grassy area. There would have been a playing surface, some bleacher seats. I understand seating was in the range of around 5,000 or so.
The field was surrounded by a strip of land on the east where there evidently were no seats at the beginning. And so people would either stand there or in some cases pull up in horses and buggies and watch the game or as much of the game as they wanted to.
Interest in football slowly grew as well. More seats were needed at Ohio Field. Attendance at some games now reached 6,000 people. A committee of university professors was asked to look at expansion. They recommended that more wooden bleachers be built, enough to hold 10,000 fans. The chair of that committee was Thomas French, a faculty member with considerable influence at Ohio State. French thought expansion of Ohio Field was a good idea.
Tom French earned his way through Ohio State by working as a draftsman in the Department of Architecture and Drawing. He graduated in 1895 with a degree in mechanical engineering and was immediately given a full-time position as an instructor in drawing.
11 years later, Thomas French is chair of his own department, which is a meteoric rise by any comparison. And some 5 years later writes a textbook for McGraw-Hill that, as textbooks go, becomes a bestseller. And as a bestseller year after year, it becomes the standard work in engineering drawing. He is early on one of the young powers in the faculty of this campus.
But life brought French unexpected misfortune. In 1903, 5 years into his marriage, French's wife died, leaving him to raise an infant daughter.
He had a daughter, and his wife passed away. And some of what happened at that point was that I think he felt that he needed to grab onto something once his wife passed away. So he grabbed onto the Ohio State University, something that he loved dearly.
French seemed to throw himself pretty wholesale into the affairs of the university. For a faculty member in the School of Architecture, he seems to be busy everywhere.
One area French devoted himself to was athletics. He loved the character sports instilled in students and organized an early athletic program at Ohio State. He recruited volunteer coaches for different sports and helped schedule games with nearby colleges. In 1909, the university accepted the recommendations of French's committee and expanded Ohio Field's seating capacity to 10,000. While French was pleased with the growing interest in football at Ohio State, he knew it still did not come close to the popularity of the game back east.
As college football really developed in the East, there were three schools that played a very, very dominant part of that. They were Ivy League schools where college football really got its big start, and they were Harvard, Yale, and Princeton. And as more people in those cities became attached to and interested in football at those three campuses, then quite naturally there was a need to build bigger stadiums to house their ever-increasing number of fans coming to these games.
Harvard Stadium, opened in 1903, held almost 45,000 fans. It was the first permanent concrete stadium of its kind in the country. Yale would build a bowl-shaped stadium in 1913 that held over 70,000. French knew how popular football was at Harvard and Yale. He wanted the same excitement for Ohio State. Soon after Ohio Field's expansion to 10,000 seats, French wrote an article for Ohio State's alumni magazine. His intent was to report the improvements at Ohio Field. But within the article, French made a daring prediction, especially for a university with nowhere near the population base as Ivy League schools.
French boldly announced his vision that someday these wooden bleachers at Ohio Field would be transformed into a magnificent concrete stadium to rival the stadiums in the East at Harvard, at Yale, at Princeton. And keep in mind, this is an extraordinary vision in 1909 when it's hard to fill 12,000 seats at Ohio Field.
Being a visionary and being able to talk about a stadium that would seat 50,000 people at a time when you had a very small school could only happen if the leadership at the top thought it was a good idea. And French really had somebody in the presidency at Ohio State who also was a visionary.
William Oxley Thompson had been president of Ohio State since 1899. An ordained minister, Thompson was also a gifted politician with a vision. Though enrollment had doubled to 3,000 in Thompson's first decade as president, public perception was that Ohio State was no different than other Ohio colleges and universities. Convinced that enrollment would continue to grow, Thompson challenged Ohio State trustees and faculty to think big.
The criticism that he had about Ohio State was that we never really were planning towards the future. It was always, let's kind of play catch up. We've got enough buildings to get us through this year. The grounds are perfect.
He is convinced that enrollments will continue to grow year after year. He's convinced that the university will be expected to perform services for the entire state of Ohio, and in meeting the needs, the expectations of the rest of the state, that the university needs to build its buildings to last for decades.
When French wrote of his vision, few people read the article. The local papers didn't mention the story. But one person was very aware of French's idea: President Thompson.
Thomas French's aspirations for Ohio Field are very much the aspirations of William Oxley Thompson for raising the stature of the university in the state and in the nation. Both of them expect the Ohio State University to be one of the premier institutions in the country.
3 years would pass. Not much changed for Ohio State football. The team continued to draw moderate crowds for games versus rivals like Otterbein and Worcester. Before French could push for a stadium, stronger opponents were needed to draw bigger crowds. French lobbied for Ohio State to join the Western Athletic Conference. That conference would later be known as the Big Ten.
It kind of puts you in a special league with a special set of competitors where you really have to prove yourself. And it's the kind of thing that starts to catch people's eye. Suddenly you're starting to get into, quote, the big leagues, and it begins to have some more seriousness.
For years, athletics at Ohio State had not had much supervision. Volunteer coaches and athletes scheduled games, raised funds, and arranged transportation to games. To meet Western Conference guidelines, President Thompson formed an athletic board. The board's mission was to organize the athletic program and approve all schedules, contracts, and expenditures. Thomas French was named head of the athletic board. French hired Ohio State's first athletic director, John Richards. French then sought a coach skilled in several sports. He found Lynn St. John, a young man who spent his mornings attending medical school and his afternoons as Ohio Wesleyan's athletic director. His life's goal was to become a physician.
St. John's job is to serve as the baseball coach, as the basketball coach, assistant coach for football, and also as the manager of athletics. You get a sense of the scale, the small scale of athletics by the diversity of responsibilities here.
But within a few months, Richards resigned unexpectedly. St. John was promoted to athletic director without his knowledge.
After he became athletic director, several individuals said, "How did you feel about this? Were you nervous prior to this happening?" He said, "I had no idea it was going to happen."
A job as athletic director would be demanding. St. John quit medical school to devote full attention to his job, a decision that would benefit Ohio State. When the 1913 season opened, Ohio State football had reached the big time. Crowds filled Ohio Field for new opponents like Indiana and Northwestern. Even though Ohio Field was handling the crowds, both French and St. John agreed that a new stadium was needed, one measured against those built in the East. French decided to again share his vision with the public.
As head of the athletic board, Thomas French represented and was called upon to speak about the athletic future of the university. In 1915, French makes a remarkable speech to the Columbus Chamber of Commerce, in which he envisions that football crowds at Ohio Field would number as many as 50,000.
Keeping in mind what a huge jump that was, is you have to admire the guy for just going out on a limb and saying, we need to do this and we need to do it soon. He was really thinking way ahead of his time and wasn't afraid to talk about it.
Unfortunately for French, those who heard his speech did not respond enthusiastically.
The idea, of course, met with all kinds of opposition. Many people felt that such an idea was kind of an unreachable goal. It's something that would never be needed. It was an extravagance. It was a needless expense. There was just no point in trying to pursue it along the lines that those two envisioned.
Then along came a 157-pound running back from Columbus, destined to be a football sensation.
Chick Harley was a football hero. He knew how to play football. And when he came to Ohio State, he found a place that was looking for him.
He was called a natural. Chick Harley was a member of East High School's powerhouse football teams of 1914 and 15. A halfback with blinding speed and a vicious tackler on defense. In 1916, Harley joined the Ohio State football team and was an immediate success.
Chick Harley, of course, had built up such a fabulous reputation at East High School in Columbus that he in East had quite a following in the city of Columbus. So it was only natural that when Harley became a member of the Ohio State football team, that the East High following that had been surprisingly large simply transferred their interest right over to Ohio State.
November 4th, 1916, Ohio State versus Wisconsin, a team considered one of the nation's best. Crowds flocked to Ohio Field to see their hometown hero.
Crowds were they were literally breaking down the gates at Ohio Field, so the university had a wonderful problem. Here's quaint old Ohio Field, which had been adequate for almost 20 years. Now suddenly, practically overnight with Chick Harley and the emergence of Ohio State, they've got a problem. They got an attendance problem. They can't find seats for everybody.
The Buckeyes finished the season undefeated and won their first Big Ten championship. Chick Harley was named Ohio State's first All-American. And no one was more pleased with the success of Ohio State football than Thomas French.
It's very possible when French made his statement to 50,000 people watching the games that some thought this is a crackpot. This is somebody who's gone overboard in his enthusiasm for the university and for university athletics. French is transformed, courtesy of Chick Harley, from a respected crackpot into a visionary with a good grasp of reality.
French moved quickly to take advantage of the team's success. He asked university engineer Clyde Morris to draw rough sketches for a new stadium, then submitted those plans to the Board of Trustees. The plans called for a stadium to be built in the woods west of Ohio Field and just north of the Oval.
It was a proposal for a concrete stadium to seat about 40,000 people, and it was oval in shape, similar to the Yale Bowl. The proposed stadium would have been nearly a tripling of the nominal capacity of Ohio Field, say about 15,000. This went up to 40,000, nearly tripled the capacity. Certainly it would have seemed to be adequate for some years to come.
Like the Yale Bowl, the new stadium would be excavated, with the playing field and some seats below ground level. Even with excavation, the stadium would be the tallest building on campus, 72 feet in height. Construction costs were estimated at $300,000.
Within the context of what the university was used to as football facilities, it certainly seems like it would have been a good plan. That plan was presented to the Board of Trustees of the university and was approved until President Thompson got a hold of it.
At first, Thompson liked the stadium plan. But when drawings were finalized, Thompson was surprised to learn the stadium would be 10 feet taller than the newly built library, the most prestigious building on campus, and it would cover 10 times the ground.
Psychologically, he was looking at it and saying, an athletic building 10 feet higher than our highest academic building, what is this showing the public? Having it put in the highest and most prominent part of our campus, what does that show the public as well?
Thompson also worried about the growing use of automobiles. On game day, many fans now drove to Ohio Field. With no parking lots on campus, cars were left anywhere there was room. Congestion was sure to escalate if the stadium was built near the Oval. Thompson wrote letters to the Board of Trustees, lobbying members to change their vote and seek a new stadium proposal. Thompson also called on university architect Joseph Bradford.
He talked with Joseph Bradford and suggested that perhaps there might be another place on campus that would suit everyone a little bit better. And Bradford came up with the idea of the floodplain of the Olentangy River.
The land suggested was located at the northwest corner of campus, 92 acres of bottomland along the Olentangy River and used by the College of Agriculture to grow corn and other crops. Bradford made preliminary drawings for the site. The extra space allowed for drastic changes in the stadium concept. Instead of a bowl-shaped stadium that held 40,000, the stadium was now shaped like a horseshoe, with the potential to seat 50,000 fans.
The second design for the stadium was one that had an open end, and there was a real reason for that. The track and field athletic department was also growing, and track and field was growing in popularity as well as football. So here was an opportunity to build a stadium that would be multi-use. One of the most popular events in track and field was the 220-yard dash, and there was no way to incorporate that into an oval stadium design. That necessitated the open end, and if you look at early photographs and early plans, you can actually see the extension of the track field well beyond the south end of the stadium.
Construction was now estimated at $500,000. The most expensive building project in university history. Soon after, French wrote an enthusiastic report on the proposed stadium for the Alumni magazine. He made no mention of how large the stadium would be.
I think the most interesting thing about the Ohio Stadium project was the fact that the actual size or seating capacity was clouded in secrecy. Many people who recognized the fact that there was a need for a stadium felt that a 30 to 35,000 seat stadium would be plenty large enough. A few, and I emphasize the word few, felt that perhaps as many as 45 to 50,000 might be needed, but really no mention was made of going above that figure.
French and St. John were now responsible for stadium planning, and the first hurdle they faced was funding. Athletics would generate some construction funds, but both men counted on money from the Board of Trustees as well. In summer 1918, French asked a 32-year-old faculty member in the School of Architecture to draw some sketches for a new stadium. The work was to follow the early design done by architect Joseph Bradford, a horseshoe-shaped structure big enough to hold 50,000 fans. French was so impressed by the sketches that he asked the young man to take on the total design for the stadium. The architect's name was Howard Dwight Smith. The stadium would be his first major project. Ten years earlier, a fellowship award allowed Smith to spend a year in Europe. His goal was to study the ancient ruins of the Roman and Greek empires. The experience would be the foundation for Smith's design work.
He sees Rome, he sees the Colosseum, he sees cathedrals, he sees churches of all kinds, he sees beautiful classical Roman, Italian architecture.
He sees the Colosseum. He sees the Pantheon. He sees the Forum. all of which he sketches, and in very intricate detail he sketches.
He wanted to go to the actual historic sites and cities where the architecture was itself, not just through textbooks or through classes, but actually go there and study them, observe, get a real feeling for what the ancient antiquities and classical architecture looked like. So I think he was totally absorbed in the subject of architecture.
10 years later, Smith put the sketches of his European trip to good use. He began work on his stadium design. The war ended in the fall of 1918. Ohio State did its best to restore university life to normal. Like most campus activities, the football team lost momentum during the war. Several players, including Chick Harley, had joined the military. The team struggled. Attendance dwindled. But by the start of the 1919 season, expectations ran high for Ohio State. Harley had finished his military service and was returning for his senior year. The team began their season with a bang. The Buckeyes won their first 6 games, including their first victory against Michigan. Their final game of the season would be at home against Illinois for the Big Ten championship. An estimated crowd of 17,000 came to Ohio Field to witness the game. More people than available tickets.
If there ever was a single football game that emphasized the total inadequacy of Ohio Field, it was the final game of the 1919 season, which was Chick Harley's final game. Literally, thousands of people broke down the gates and got in and absolutely overflowed Ohio Field to a point where, without question, the largest crowd in the history of Ohio State football up to that time.
People were doing anything possible to get into this game. They're up in trees, they're breaking down fences, there are people up in rooftops of neighboring houses. Ohio Field at that time held about 12, maybe 13,000 people. There were actually 17,000 people in the stands that day on the old wooden bleachers. L.W. St. John, the athletic director, all of a sudden realized he had a real safety problem on his hands.
Worried about crowd control and the possible collapse of the wooden bleachers, Thomas French knew his opportune moment had arrived. It was time to push the Board of Trustees for a new stadium. From his nearly completed design, Smith estimated that the stadium could hold 50,000 fans. But that wasn't big enough for Lynn St. John. Since the day 17,000 people jammed into Ohio Field for the Big Ten championship, St. John swore he could have sold at least 50,000 tickets for that game. He argued with Thomas French that the proposed stadium wasn't big enough.
St. John fit in perfectly with Thompson and French. He also thought big, and his dreams were perhaps even going beyond what French had in mind. There were times when French would talk about a stadium for 50,000 people, and St. John would say, well, maybe 60,000 people.
We would have loved to have overheard the conversations that were taking place in the boardrooms and during luncheons during this time period. You know, what was the limit? Why stop at 50, 70, 80,000 people?
After much debate, French finally agreed to St. John's push for an even larger stadium. He instructed Smith to continue work on the design, but to now include as many seats as possible, as long as spectator comfort could be maintained.
Now was the time to strike, and French went to the university and said, this is the time to do it. Let's fund this stadium. The response he got was, that's fine, the stadium's a wonderful idea, but the university itself will not incur any cost in building it. It's something you've got to build yourself.
French was devastated. The trustees would permit a new stadium on university land, but would give nothing toward construction. The man behind the decision was President Thompson.
OSU was being very supportive of the idea, but Thompson was very shrewd, and he realized he didn't want to put university resources into building this stadium. He wanted to have the building, but he wanted somebody else to pay for it.
The trustees and the president were looking to the legislature, as they had done in the past and still do, for support for academic programs. And the fear was that if they go to the legislature and ask for money, they will do so at the expense of other priorities. In a sense, the trustees' refusal to support financially the stadium opened up opportunities for the stadium leaders. If they could raise the money privately, then they would have no imposed limits upon what could be built.
French faced an overwhelming task. With barely $100,000 in reserve funds, he and St. John would have to raise $500,000. But as the design was upgraded, Howard Dwight Smith told French construction costs could rise to $1 million.
Raising money privately is a new experience for The Ohio State University. It had always accepted willingly private donations in the past, but had never done so systematically.
They came up with really what was a brilliant idea, and that was making Ohio Stadium a possession not only of the university and Columbus, but of the entire state. They decided that they would go to the alumni of the university and talk to them about the importance of the stadium and the need for their support on a statewide basis.
French and St. John decided to take the risk. They would convince the public to donate money for a new 50,000-seat stadium for Ohio State. But in describing the project to the public, both men decided to withhold key information.
They kept the fact that they wanted even more than 50,000 people in that stadium to themselves.
The general design of the stadium is known, but what is not known is the exact size and how much it's going to cost. Those things are left in secret, if you will, until it becomes more apparent exactly how much money can be raised for the stadium.
They had to make an impact, and the impact had to be dramatic, it had to be quick, it had to be successful pretty early on. So the idea was to come up with a stadium week in October, for a whole week of October.
Let's do a big celebration, and let's do this to coincide with Ohio State's 50th anniversary. And let's make this something that involves the city, the Ohio State University, but in particular our students.
Simon Lazarus of the Lazarus Company is in charge of publicity for the campaign, and his objective is to make everyone in the city of Columbus aware at all times of the stadium issue, the urgency for it, the necessity for building the stadium for the good not only of the university but also the city of Columbus.
There was no idea that was too small or too big. It was, let's just do it.
Saturday, October 16, 1920, a campus-wide ox roast and carnival kicked off Ohio State's 50th anniversary celebration. Simon Lazarus invited reporters from every Ohio newspaper to attend the carnival. Word spread that something big would be announced at the event. More like colossal. A model of the proposed Ohio Stadium was unveiled to the public. The public was asked to donate $1 million for construction.
The plans they released during Stadium Week were the ones for the stadium that was really proposed. Nobody's talking about 50,000 seats anymore. They're talking about a big stadium.
A lot of people gasped. It was a big jump. It was huge.
Once the whole plan was kind of out on the table, obviously, as it is today, you had people who were criticizing this. The critics were there. What is it going to look like when you have 10,000 people in a 50,000 seat stadium. How embarrassing is that going to be when no one's there to watch the team play and a photographer takes a picture of the empty stands? It's going to be embarrassing. So this is what we were facing as a university at that time from our critics.
Monday, October 18th, 6 a.m. Cannon fire echoed across the Oval, announcing to campus neighbors that the stadium campaign was officially underway. Lazarus assembled more than 3,000 Ohio State students. All were dressed in athletic clothes. Their mission? To parade en masse down High Street to the State House to promote the stadium.
Again, High Street isn't what it is today. It was a smaller road, had trolley tracks in the middle, and here are 3,000 Ohio State students in full athletic garb walking down the street, parading floats, everything possible that they could do to attract people's attention to the fine, well-toned bodies that Ohio State men had at this point.
When they arrived, everybody started doing calisthenics, pushing this whole physical fitness, physical readiness aspect of the whole stadium idea. The idea was that you get this before the people and get them thinking and talking about it.
More than 100,000 people witnessed the parade and received the sly, unspoken message from Simon Lazarus.
Lazarus basically almost approached scare tactics, although I wouldn't go that far in saying that. What he was saying to the public in general was, if we don't build that stadium, what kind of shape will our youth be in? Again, what if there is another war? Well, look at our universities. Look what Ohio State's doing. They're keeping our folks in shape for that war if it ever comes about again.
To accentuate that point, yet another spectacle was planned for Stadium Week, what Lazarus called Military Day. Over 1,000 members of the University Cadet Corps, infantry and artillery regiments again marched down High Street. After the parade, the cadets staged a mock battle along the Olentangy River, reinforcing that the stadium site would also be used for military training.
They were performing. It was a huge organized performance, and it was just, must have been an amazing sight to be in Columbus that week, because it was day after day of events and activities that just kept reinforcing the need for this stadium.
Lazarus and his group came up with a number of ideas. There were signs everywhere, downtown in the university area, on the State House lawn. If you went in to buy a pack of cigarettes or a cigar, there might be a matchbook with a matchbook cover saying Ohio Stadium, the magnet.
The publicity campaign is overwhelming. There are placards in stores saying if you buy this hat or raincoat or whatever, a percentage of the profit will go to the stadium. There are people with placards walking around emphasizing the stadium. You can't open a newspaper, read a magazine article without seeing some kind of advertisement for the campaign. And it is truly the biggest campaign that the city of Columbus has seen, at least on a par with raising money for World War I.
Amid the massive publicity, donations poured in for the stadium. $46,000 the first day alone.
People gave. People gave money, farmers gave, business people in the communities gave to Ohio State. They gave with open arms. All of a sudden, the interest in Ohio Stadium wasn't just that university up the road a piece. It was their stadium. They had given money. In many cases, they had given of their time.
The campaign was a phenomenal success. Originally, the leaders of the campaign had been warned that they should expect no more than $300,000 from the fundraising effort. They had $1 million objective. Within 5 weeks of the start of the campaign, they had raised over $900,000.
By January 1921, 3 months after the start of its campaign, the Stadium Committee reached its $1 million goal. No one was more pleased than Thomas French. Nearly 12 years had passed since French first wrote of his vision for a stadium for Ohio State. It appeared that vision would soon come true. But even at that moment, a battle was underway within the Board of Trustees to prevent the construction of Ohio Stadium.
Even though the campaign succeeded in raising the money, approval authority was still, for the project, was still with the Board of Trustees. Ultimately, they had the say-so as to what would be built and where it would be built. And that issue, as it turned out, was still in debate.
When it appeared the funding goal would be met, Thomas French asked university engineer Clyde Morris to visit several eastern cities. Morris's task was to examine large stadiums and bridges made of concrete.
Clyde Morris is sent east to study stadiums at Princeton, Harvard, Yale, Polo Grounds, to examine these massive concrete structures and to learn from them and make recommendations for specifications for the stadium. He's interested in all kinds of details, and he's especially interested in how durable the material of concrete appears to be.
Well, concrete was getting, of course, better known every year, but there was still, in terms of long-term durability, there still wasn't a great track record for this material. It had only been widely used probably for about a 20-year period, and the way they built buildings at that time, 20 years was not very long.
Morris returned and wrote a positive report supporting the use of concrete for Ohio Stadium. He noted that most of the concrete structures he saw were holding up well, but mentioned problems at Palmer Stadium, Princeton's 7-year-old sports facility.
It wasn't very old, just a few years, but it was beginning to show some deterioration. He attributed that to a poor concrete mix, not to the nature of concrete itself, but to that particular job where he felt that the problems arose from low-quality concrete.
The Morris report was given to Thomas French and the stadium design team. But a copy somehow found its way to Thomas Mendenhall, an influential member of the Board of Trustees and a physics professor on Ohio State's original faculty.
As a professor of physics, he's very much concerned about the longevity of the material. Will concrete last long enough for the stadium not to be an embarrassment to the university?
Mendenhall sent a letter to President Thompson and members of the Board of Trustees. He accused stadium supporters of megalomania for emphasizing size rather than quality of construction. He argued the proposed stadium would rarely, if ever, be filled to capacity, and worried about the psychological effect on the football team in playing to so many empty seats. He argued there were still questions about the durability of concrete and pointed to the problems at Palmer Stadium. Mendenhall then offered his own stadium proposal.
He suggests a smaller stadium, perhaps 40,000 individuals made of brick. This is a tried and true method at this point. Let's have a brick stadium that's smaller. You're never going to get more than 40,000 people into a football game, my goodness.
Mendenhall was very upfront about the fact that he was going to fight this stadium plan, and he wrote a letter to the trustees. He wrote a letter to the president of the university and said, I'm going to bring it up and I'm going to fight it. So Thompson warned the trustees that the next meeting there was going to be discussion, and it would likely be a very lengthy debate, and they should plan to stay overnight.
May 24th, 1921. The Board of Trustees met to decide the final fate for the new stadium.
I'm sure there were some voices raised. I'm sure there were some tempers that flared during this time, because everybody loved Ohio State University, all of them.
On the one hand, you have Mendenhall arguing against the plan. On the other hand, you have French and St. John standing firm that they believe this is the thing to do. And at some point in the meeting, it's believed that Thompson finally said, we need to build it, and that probably ended the debate.
The Board of Trustees voted 6-1 in favor of building Ohio Stadium. Thomas Mendenhall was the lone vote against. August 3rd, 1921. 1,000 people assembled in front of University Hall, then marched to the stadium site for groundbreaking ceremonies. The 4th Regiment Band played Fight the Team and Carmen, Ohio. Ohio Governor Harry Davis wielded the first shovel, followed by anyone else who wanted to turn. Howard Dwight Smith and Thomas French had planned an aggressive construction schedule. The stadium would be ready to open for the 1922 football season, just 14 months away.
In this day and age, 13 months is nothing short of astonishing to think. The use of the structural steel allowed them to continue construction during the cold winter months when obviously you couldn't set concrete. So it was a 13-month continual frenzy of activity on the site. It was not interrupted.
The stadium contains some 5,300 tons of steel, 4,000 tons of structural steel, 1,300 tons of reinforcing steel for the concrete. You had materials in this stadium that were equivalent to maybe half a dozen office buildings of the period that would have been built with a similar technology. It really was a major construction project.
And all this is done by the most primitive methods you could think of in what we do today. They had no forklifts, they didn't have cranes, they didn't have specialized scaffolding or forms. Everything was built.
It took 13 months, but by the last week of September 1922, most of the construction on Ohio Stadium was complete. The final construction cost was $1.6 million. The total debt incurred by the athletic board? Nearly $500,000.
Here you have a great number of very professional, professorial types, community leaders, putting their heart and their head and their reputation on the line. The stadium is constructed. We know it'll hold 63,000 folks for any game. Standing room only 80,000. There they are. Will the people come?
October 7th. The Buckeyes opened the 1922 football season at home against a non-conference opponent, old rival Ohio Wesleyan. The largest crowd to ever witness a football game in the state of Ohio flocked to the new stadium to see Ohio State beat Ohio Wesleyan 5-0. 25,000 fans.
There had to have been critics at the time saying, we told you so. Here's the first game, and you can't even fill it for the first game. So I'm sure there were a lot of people who were very nervous after that first game.
Even at 25,000, you still had more than half of the stadium empty, which must have been a depressing and concerning sight.
I'm sure lots of naysayers felt vindicated, but I can't help but think that Thompson and French and the others knew they were on the right track, that the numbers would come.
The true test for attendance would come the following week. The athletic board decided a few months earlier to hold an official dedication game for Ohio Stadium. They would wait until October 21st, when Big Ten rival Michigan came to town. The day before the big game, President Thompson led volunteers to the stadium. The upper deck was almost finished, save for 100 seats, and construction crews didn't have time to clean the stadium. Faculty and students were recruited to sweep it out. The press also picked up on the importance of the event, promoting the game like none other at Ohio State. Game day arrived, and by late morning it seemed as though America had indeed discovered Columbus. Attendance was standing room only. People stood in aisles and walkways, jammed into seats and temporary bleachers, anywhere there was room. No one felt more vindicated than Thomas French and Lynn St. John.
Estimates for that third game were somewhere between 72 and 78,000 people, a number equal to about a quarter of the population of Ohio's capital city. That's a lot of people.
The pride in that dedication day extended well beyond the people who were the moving force behind getting the stadium built. It really extended to the folks who were sitting in the stands, because so many of them were likely contributors, where they felt that their donation, whatever it was, whether it was $1 or $100 or $1,000, had helped to make this a reality. So they felt a real personal attachment to the project, and as a result could share in the feeling of its success.
Following that game, attendance at Ohio Stadium usually averaged between 20 and 30,000 people, much larger than the crowds at Ohio Field, but nowhere near stadium capacity. But French and St. John never lost their belief that people would one day fill the stadium on a consistent basis. And as the 20s passed, the debt for the stadium was retired, and attendance slowly grew.
It wasn't until after World War II that Ohio Stadium began to be filled to capacity on a regular basis to achieve the kinds of numbers we're used to seeing every year, year after year now. It took a long time. It was over 20 years. I feel that that wouldn't have been a surprise to Thompson or to French or any of the others who had this long-term vision of what the university would become. They knew the place was going to grow. They knew the student body would continue to grow, that the constituency for the athletic program would continue to grow, and they didn't want a place that was going to be outmoded after 20 years. The fact that it was just coming into its own after 20 or 25 years, that was fine. That was how it should have been.
It's been standing now since 1922. Over 30 million people have passed through its arches. You know what it's like to find a ticket, any ticket, for a football game.
Ohio Stadium has become something more than just a place to watch a football game. It's become a symbol of the university.
Look at what Ohio Stadium is. Look at the kinds of crowds that are drawn to the university. Sometimes when I'm in Ohio Stadium and I think about the individuals who made this possible, I don't think we give them enough credit for their courage and their foresight as to what this truly would be. People said it couldn't be done, yet here it is.
William Oxley Thompson retired in 1925. In 26 years as president of Ohio State, Thompson watched his vision for the university become reality. Enrollment grew from 1,000 to 14,000 students, as Ohio State was acknowledged as one of the nation's premier universities. He died in 1933, 11 years after the completion of Ohio Stadium. For the rest of his life, Thomas French taught, wrote textbooks, and collected puzzles. In the 22 years from Ohio Stadium's inception until his death in 1944, French only saw football attendance grow to 40,000 at most games, still well short of stadium capacity. Lynn St. John served as Ohio State's athletic director for over 30 years. Many credit him with turning the university into an athletic powerhouse. He died in 1950 as he prepared to attend a football game at Ohio Stadium. And Chick Harley? Soon after graduating, Harley developed a nervous disorder that left him semi-invalid for the rest of his life. But once in a while, friends would pick Harley up at the Illinois hospital where he lived and drive him to Columbus. They would take Harley to the stadium by the river, a stadium many claimed would not have been built were it not for his athletic skills. And there he would watch a game of football.
To order a copy of this program, The Birth of Ohio Stadium, call 1-800-7-VOICES. The cost is $24.95 plus shipping and handling. Order now.
Major funding for the Birth of Ohio Stadium was provided by the S. O'Donnell family and by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
This is PBS.